Welcome back to the channel, guys. Thank you very much for joining me again. Today it's the turn of Alfa Romeo and the C41, their 2021 Challenger. Above you can see last year's car, the C39. Let's just clear up why there is a seemingly obvious gap in the middle between C39 and C41. It's because the C40 was the name they gave to the car that they've been working on before we decided to carry over elements of 2020's car into 2021. The C40 was what is now the 2022 car. This huge change coming that was due for this year was always going to be called the C40, so Alfa Romeo have decided to keep it that way. So next year's 2022 car, heavily in development right now, will, at the moment at least, be called the C40, meaning that the 2021 car is the C41. Confused? That's what it is anyway, and none of that matters. Let's take a look at the car, because this is a car like every other car on the grid for this year that's very much an evolution of what came before, in no small part because of the restrictions, the technical restrictions enforced on the teams to limit spending off the back of a very difficult 2020 due to the global pandemic. The C41 carries over a huge amount of what came before. At the rear end especially, seemingly at least from the outside, the rear end very similar. There are some detail changes. You can just see straight away from that profile there's a slightly different change, an aerodynamic change in terms of the profiling of the engine cover. Part of that is simply aerodynamic, and part of that may well be to repackage a new Ferrari power unit that lies beneath. If Ferrari have managed to take some of the cooling components like intercoolers, radiators out of the side pod and place them along the centre line of the car, which is a trend that's been operating in Formula One for some years, they not only managed to slim down the side pods that enables you to get some extra airflow around the edge, gives you an aerodynamic benefit around this area, but also by placing them up here, you manage to reprofile the centre line of the car. You do take, of course, a centre of gravity hit, a negative, in that moving those components higher up the car raises your centre of gravity, something that you want as low as possible to improve the balance of the car, but you offset that with this potential gain around the side pods of the car and the aerodynamic features that can be drafted off the back of that. So that's possibly, without seeing what's really underneath, that's possibly a way that Ferrari have gone. The power unit, of course, is an area that Alfa Romeo desperately will be hoping can bring them significant improvement. If you believe the talk coming out of Italy from Ferrari's camp and the Italian media, the Ferrari power unit, an all-new power unit for 2021, perfectly allowed by the regulations, by the way, seemingly is a vast improvement. Now you might say, well, of course it's a vast improvement because last year was disastrous, and it was. But you very rarely hear a team bigging up their own claims long before a season has even begun. Now that's either a PR disaster from Ferrari, or that's a team that's very confident of bringing improvements to them and to their customer teams. And if you think about somebody like Alfa Romeo, keep calling them Sauber. If you think about somebody like Alfa Romeo, one of the things that hampered them hugely last year, along with Haas, was the limited performance they had from their power unit, particularly at some circuits. So if they can get an improvement in that, this car, just with that alone, could find itself much further up the order and mixing it in the front, in the midfield, rather than at the back in the last three teams of Alfa Romeo, Haas and Williams. They'll be hoping for improvement, and some of that could well come from Ferrari's power unit. There are a couple of little detail changes to the side of the chassis that you can see here on the new one, not present on the old one. Just a little couple of flow directors, little flaps directing the airflow. You can actually clearly see what's happening. The flow coming off the front suspension here along this profile along here is being redirected by these two little flaps. You can see where they're aiming. They're redirecting that flow downwards in a downwards trajectory into this channel around the base of the side pods, that's then being fed in through this Coke bottle using what we call the Coanda effect, where the flow remains attached to a curved section of bodywork, which means that if it's fed through here, it doesn't just exit out here, it remains attached, it sticks to the bodywork and follows the contours, driven into that really important Coke bottle area above the back of the top of the diffuser. The more airflow, the more flow we can get shoveled into this gap here, the more effective essentially that diffuser can become in drawing flow through the underside and creating downforce. We know that we've lost a huge amount of the capability to create downforce and to seal off, to maximise the potential of that diffuser by the changes that the regulations have made to the floor. In this area here, we haven't got a top-down shot of this one, but you saw on the McLaren video how it's tapered in towards the rear tyres. Again, you can't really see. It makes the car look like it's got an even bigger rake than it has because the floor is tapered. I'm not going to read too much into the rake angle of the car here partly because of that, and secondly because this is simply just a launch spec photo. But the fact that we've lost some of this potential around the rear end of the floor here, we've lost around 10% of the downforce producing effect at that end of the car, has driven some much more significant changes, particularly for Alfa Romeo, further forward. So if the rear end of the car is very similar to last year, the front end is considerably different. Notably, the nose cone and the associated aerodynamic pieces around there. Now, Alfa Romeo, along with Ferrari and AlphaTauri, were really the last three teams to employ that really wide nose section that they had last year. Everybody else seemingly heading down the path that Mercedes had pioneered with a much narrower nose cone. Now, there are pros and cons to both. A wider section nose is in theory able to generate more downforce because it creates a larger low pressure zone underneath it. And a low pressure zone underneath a section of bodywork will speed up the airflow that passes through there and therefore create more downforce because the higher pressure air above is trying to force its way down to the low pressure zone and it pushes the car down. Now, the downside of going the other way and having a narrower nose, or one of the downsides at least, is that it becomes much harder to pass the FIA crash tests. You've got less area to absorb all of that energy that has to be absorbed in the event of a crash. So homologating a narrower nose cone comes with its own challenges from that regard. There are also some areas around a narrow nose cone that mean that you have to be a lot more detailed, a lot more accurate about how you control the flow from the front wingtips and from the pillars of the nose cone and the leading edges of the nose tip. How you control that flow in a narrower nose section, there's more scope, let's say, for it to go wrong. With a wider section, you've got a narrower channel. There's less distance between these tips of this wing, for example, and this area here where the pillars and the front of the cape spiral up vortices that can then combine to become more powerful further down the car. With a narrow nose section with more space, there's essentially more area or more possibility for that flow to get lost or become uncontrolled. So you just have to be a little bit more accurate about how you do manage that. Now, what's happened at Alfa Romeo is they've gone somewhere in between. This is narrower than they had last year, totally reprofiled, but nowhere near following the trend that others like Mercedes have gone down. And I quite like that. This is not just a Ferrari junior team that's essentially copying what their parent company has delivered. They've got their own thought process, and that I think we should celebrate. If we want diversity of thinking up and down the grid, this is the kind of thing we should be championing, that they've gone off on their own direction. And I like that. They have still retained a version of the nostrils that we saw last year on the C39, but quite different in the way that it's profiled. Still doing a very similar job in channeling flow through these sections around the wide pillars of the nose cone. But this year what they're doing is feeding that onto a completely reprofiled cape. The section that runs underneath the nose cone, you can see it comes now much further forward. It starts almost right at the nose tip. You can see it running right around here. Much wider, much bigger, essentially much more effective. Now what this nostril here is doing is feeding flow onto the top of that cape. That's then directing flow down towards the front leading edge of the floor. I talked before about how the diffuser has lost some of its protection from the edges of the outer edges of the floor in sealing it, in losing some of its effectiveness. If we can drive more flow underneath the car, starting right here at the front, we can start to claim some of that back. That's the thinking behind this. The wider cape with these little tips that you can see here create a tip vortex on either side that will then be fed down towards this now really important bargeboard area. The bargeboards have always been important in a Formula One car. They do a number of different jobs, but because again of what's been lost further back down the car, they now become even more crucial in playing a role in clawing back some of that performance. So this little vortex coming off here will spiral up and feed its way down towards the barge boards, where it will then be managed and sent off to the various jobs that it essentially needs to do. together with this Y250 vortex, vortices that combining off each of these wingtips to make a big, powerful, the most powerful of all the vortices that we see coming off this front end, produced off these little tips. When it combines and heads down towards this area, the barge boards then use that for a number of different things, predominantly to help drive away from the car the messy, turbulent wake coming off these front tyres. I've talked about this before, but if you don't know, the front tyres are an aerodynamicist's worst nightmare. Aero guys love a fixed, controlled surface that they can manage the flow from. Well, the front wheels and tyres are the opposite of that. They're rotating, they're bouncing over the racetrack, they're turning through a steering axis as well, they're squashing over the lumps and bumps, and that means the profile off the back of them is constantly changing. And we get this messy, horrible, turbulent flow coming off the back of the tyre, which if left unchecked would just ruin the flow going around the edge of the side pods, ruin all of that flow at the rear of the car, which we talked about before, trying to protect the flow through the diffuser. If this was left unchecked, it would destroy all of that. So this big powerful vortex, in combination with the barge boards, which you'll see in a moment, help to drive that flow away from the car and take with it a lot of that messy, turbulent wake from the front tyre, leaving the other components that we've talked about to feed airflow, to direct flow to the critical areas where we actually want to use it to create downforce and to create efficiency. In a similar way, we've got a slightly different profile on the front wing. A little step here. You can see in the way that it's lined up with these inboard tips of the front wing that it's doing a very similar job. It's helping to drive flow to combine with this powerful vortex that will then help, as I said before, to be driven rearwards to these crucial parts of the floor of the barge board and floor down there. Very much a heavily loaded inboard front wing where all the downforce is created at this inboard section, a trend that we saw developed over the last couple of years. This is a very high downforce option, something that will change depending on where we go in the circuit. So don't read too much into the size of this, because this is just one option that we'll have a number of. And we'll see what they do when they come to an actual race circuit as to which configuration they use. But pretty clear, they are still favouring the inboard loaded front wing that so many other teams are using. And that Alfa Romeo went very extreme with. So much so that at the outboard end there's almost no downforce being produced. This is to help just drive flow out through a slightly curved end plate there, again helping to drive flow away from the car, taking with it some of that messy tyre wake at the front end there. So here you can start to see the complexity of the barge board area. I'm not going to go into detail because these are very similar to last year's, and I have no doubt they won't be the specification that we see when the car hits the racetrack. But the complexity of these tells you just how important they are, and I believe that will only get more and more complex as the early part of this season and what development there will be on the 2021 cars will happen. Development on the 2021 cars will be hugely limited this year for most people because you have to split your resource between 2021 and the huge change coming in 22. What will be interesting to see is if a team like Alfa Romeo can manage to join that midfield battle where it might be really tight. If they're in a tight battle, who's going to give in first? Who's going to switch resource off this year's battle, which could have a big impact, let's not forget, both financially but also when it comes to things like the wind tunnel or the aerodynamic research restrictions that are now in play, meaning that you get a sliding scale of restriction on your aero development based on where you finish in the championship. Those are all critical things to develop the development of next year's car, and you can't just give them up easily. So whilst you've got to manage your resource on how much you spend, how much time and money you spend on this year's car compared to what you will have in the big opportunity of 22, if they're in a tight battle, it's not something you can just throw away easily. So that will be fascinating to see. But yeah, these barge boards, complex and an area that will be worked on, I have no doubt, in the early part of the season. But you can just start to see now with the angle of that how that flow coming through from the front wing, from that cape, will be picked up here. Part of it will be redirected in a really aggressive fashion to come out away from the car. Now you might think that's inefficient, it's just lost controlled flow, but it isn't. It's actually doing a very important job in dragging away this messy wake off the tyre. So a huge amount of that flow of power is spent, if you like, from an aerodynamics perspective, on dragging that flow away from the car. Most of the other end, rear end of the car, very similar, if not identical to the C39. You can see at the back they've added a double T-wing. Just there, you can see it. It's an addition that wasn't on last year's car, however it will be something that will be very circuit specific, so we won't focus too much on that. But it's another indication that where we've started to lose downforce through regulation, they're having to find new ways to claw that back, to find new elements that can generate some of that lost downforce, just to bring them back to somewhere near the performance level that they were at the end of 2020. That could be one of the areas they're looking to work on that. Most other things the same. The diffuser height has been raised up. It's a very darkened picture. We can't see the detail on that, but that's again something that all teams have had to reprofile. And the effect of that is that we lose some control with a shortened diffuser strakes. These vertical strakes are now a bit shorter. We lose some of the control of the flow that's exiting that diffuser. What they do is to give that some control, make it less messy and turbulent in the section closest to the car. You can imagine if right behind the car you've got a really messy, swirling, turbulent mess of flow exiting the diffuser, it creates a drag penalty because it essentially acts as a big blocker for the rest of the flow that wants to come through that diffuser. So these long vertical strakes are there to try and separate the flow, control it, keep it in some way linear, a little bit further away from the car to allow a clearer path for the rest of that flow coming through. We've lost some of that ability, which was exactly the intention, to slow down the cars, create a drag penalty and effectively lose downforce. So this will be another area that teams will be working on, although there is limited scope in what they can do. So an interesting car at the front end, very much a carryover to some extent at the rear end, but I think Alfa Romeo will be pinning a lot of their hopes on what Ferrari can deliver to them in terms of a power unit that could have a significant impact on their championship challenge if we believe the claims that are coming out of Ferrari right now. Let's wait and see.